Fáilte romh go léir chuig an ócáid seo, chun ar ggóthail faoin lucht siúil, Mincéirs agus an Stát idir 1952 agus 2022 a cheola. Tásúla go minic sibh tainmh agus tarifás. You're all very welcome to this event to launch and explain our conference on Travellers, Mincéirs and the Irish State from 1922 to 2022, with particular emphasis on the struggle for equality. The conference will take place in NUI Galway between the 16th and 17th of September. My name is Mary Harris, and I was until recently a member of the Department of History in NUI Galway. And I'd like to say a few words about how the conference came about. It arose from a presentation to the Expert Advisory Group on Commemoration last year. The presentation was from Patrick Nevin, who was manager of Tallaght Travellers Community Development Project, and Elaine Martin, who's principal psychologist specialist with the HSE. So this was a really interesting and convincing presentation, highlighting the independent state's failures in relation to travellers and the psychological impact of inequality on them. And this situation was particularly remiss, again, seen against the background of the revolutionary period we're commemorating. As you probably know, the 1916 proclamation highlighted a guarantee to equality of opportunity for all. So following the presentation, a conference steering committee was set up comprising Elaine, myself, John Cunningham and Sarah Ann Buckley, both of whom have been very heavily involved in planning this event. They are members of the History Department in NUI Galway and co-directors of the Centre for the Histories of Labour and Class. And then, of course, we were very glad to add to our number Owen Ward, who's NUI Galway's Traveller Education Officer. So today, the 8th of April, is International Travellers and Roma Day, and this is the date we initially chose for the conference. But by early January, when the COVID numbers were soaring, this didn't seem wise. So we decided to defer it until September, because a crucial aspect of the conference will be hopefully not only what goes on in the formal sessions, but also the informal interaction between travellers and members of the settled community. So this is going to be a multidisciplinary conference involving academic papers and personal narratives and discussions on traveller activism. The conference will be funded by the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht Sport and the Media. And we have also received support from Polo, the hÓgartaigh, our registrar, and from the Galway Council of Trade Unions. So to begin it all, I'd like you all now to listen to a message of support we had from President Michael D. Higgins. As you probably know, President Higgins has been a very long-standing supporter of the traveller community. So we'll proceed now to President Higgins' message.
Hōgartaigh, dear friends, may I say how delighted I am to have the opportunity to join you, even if it has to be virtually, for the launch of what is a most important conference, examining and reflecting as it does on the position of Irish travellers in Ireland across the past 100 years. It is particularly apt that this conference takes place on International Traveller and Roma Day, a day which invites us to reflect on the many challenges still facing Roma and travellers and the strategies necessary to meet those challenges. The distinctive history, identity and tradition of Irish travellers is woven deeply into the story and culture of Ireland, and it has made a significant and positive contribution to Irish society. For so many generations, Mincéirs were a familiar and welcome sight in Irish towns and villages as they offered labour to our farmers, offer their skills in the rearing and selling of horses, mending and restoring household objects, and bringing to our doors for sale or exchange a range of beautifully crafted objects such as lace and paper flowers. It is to those basic, so close to nature communities, such as the travelling community, that we owe a special debt. It is they who have brought music, song and dance surviving into our homes and our shared public spaces today. It is impossible to overestimate the profound contribution they've made to our musical heritage, including, of course, our now UNESCO-recognised unique piping tradition. Indeed, some of the greatest musicians of our contemporary times, singers and dancers, come from our traveller community. Performers such as Finbar Fury, Margaret Barry, Johnny Doran, and Thomas McCarthy, who I had the pleasure of hearing sing at the launch of NUIG's Traveller Ethnicity Day celebrations at the end of February. These performers have been keeping our distinct music and song alive and relevant, and they have brought it to places far beyond Irish shores. The decision by our state just a few years ago, and indeed after a long struggle, to acknowledge the traveller community as an indigenous ethnic minority was a welcome one. There remains, however, very significant ground to cover and many changes, not just to state policy, but its implementation to be made if we are to resource, enable and achieve full participation for a significant group of our citizens who are regularly excluded from so many areas of society. Today's conference is part of the Decade of Centenaries programme, during which we commemorate the seminal events that led to, accompanied or succeeded the founding moments of the Irish state. This is a decade during which we must consider how we have used the hard-won independence that is our legacy. Ask ourselves as to whether we have lived up to the dreams and ideals for which they who founded our state sacrificed so much. A true republic must be built on principles and policies, surely ones which recognize the common welfare. Such recognition must also comprise an understanding that democracy is never static, is always and must be a work in progress, evolving in a way that includes and respects all of its citizens in all of their diversities. Be a republic that is leaving no one behind, is on a constant onward journey towards new futures and new possibilities. Féidearthachtaí nua, that are to be shared and celebrated together, le chéile. Across the world, we have witnessed many nomadic and indigenous groups being put under pressure, indeed forced, to embrace new and what are suggested modern ways of living that contradict their culture. They have been pushed and commanded to conform to a uniform approach, to define concepts such as nationality, home, nature, and human settlement. Ireland is sadly no exception. Our transition from predominantly agriculture to an industrial or service economy has brought to the travelling community some of the most difficult challenges. The erosion of their traditional roles and their consequent forced move to urbanised areas for housing led to increased attempts by the state to fade their past practices and culture from national memory. Their distinctive nomadic lifestyle, which had so enriched our shared heritage, was put at risk. That desire to completely ignore, indeed seek to eliminate, a critical element of our past and to pressure travellers to assimilate into mainstream Irish society continues to be a shameful, unwelcome chapter in our nation's history. The report of the Commission on Itineracy of 1963 had clearly identified the travelling community as a problem. Its main recommendation and objective was of ensuring travellers would be absorbed into the general and settled community which was perceived as superior. It was paternalistic and it was ill-informed. Almost 60 years on from the publication of that report, we witness today some important changes. But yet, a republic that continues to push an integral and valuable group of citizens who, in the words of the Constitution that underpins our society, are entitled to be cherished equally. Onto the margins of that society. Such marginalisation and exclusion is a daily part of the life for a community that is forced not just to battle to retain a culture now deemed to be in conflict with the norms and standards of a new and modern Ireland, but for basic rights in areas such as housing, health and education. Our Ireland is one that continues to grievously fail our travelling community, and the stark statistics speak for themselves. For example, the unacceptable gap between educational attainments by members of the travelling community and members of the settled community, the high rates of unemployment within the travelling community, the disproportionate number of travellers who are part of our prison population, the lower life expectancy, higher mortality rates and higher suicide rates associated with the lives of travellers, form a litany of indictments on a so-called republic whose state policies have so badly let down our traveller community. The facts are there for all of us to see. I recently visited Ciarán Ó Brown halting site in Galway and met with families who have had for many years been living in substandard conditions and continue to do so. A few days later, the Council of Europe reiterated their views on the deplorable conditions in which many of our travellers are forced to live. The Council of Europe has expressed concern that no work had been done on implementing appropriate recommendations to increase national oversight on the delivery of traveller accommodation. As a society, we should be profoundly embarrassed by such a failure of state policy, which has seen the financialisation of housing for speculative short and long-term gain, housing as a commodity, while large numbers of citizens are deprived of that most basic of human rights, a safe and secure place that they can call home. Such exclusionary policies are the antithesis of any concept of democracy, or indeed of any true definition of a republic. If we are to reclaim that title, to justifiably call ourselves a Republic of Ireland, we must, as citizens, cease to tolerate the degree of exclusion and neglect that exists in our society, the creation and perpetuation of groups who are marginalised and vulnerable, and the development of policies that fail to address, indeed so often enable, social exclusion. As we reflect on 100 years of independence, we must do so honestly, taking into account our failures as well as our achievements, resolving to address them as we continue the ongoing work of crafting a democracy, accepting, celebrating, and most importantly, resourcing and enabling the traveller identity, heritage, and culture that is written so deeply into our nation's story, are the tools by which we can defeat prejudice, discrimination, and the ignorant stereotyping of the traveller community. At this point, may I commend Dr. Deirdre Hardiman and Dr. Helen Casey on being chosen as the recipients of this year's Michael McDonagh Award for Traveller Ally Excellence. This award, named after the late Michael McDonagh, who worked so generously and tirelessly on behalf of his community, is a moving and appropriate statement of National University of Ireland Galway's commitment to inclusion and diversity, and to supporting staff who show leadership and example in relation to the advancement of travellers' rights in many areas, including education. Drs. Hardiman and Casey have demonstrated those qualities most impressively. I thank them for their spirit of solidarity and shared humanity. May I also congratulate Jason Sherlock, who has been honoured with lifetime membership of the Mincéirs Whidden Society, a much-deserved recognition. And may I thank John Cunningham, my former colleague, a historian who is doing so much for a historiography that is inclusive and scholarly in his view from below, and indeed all those who have been involved in bringing this conference to fruition, and those who, in various capacities, work so hard to improve the landscape for our travelling community. I include among those Owen Ward, who is NUIG's first full-time traveller education officer, and President Ciarán Ó hÓgartaigh, Míle Buíochas, who is such a strong advocate of traveller access to education, and all of your good selves who, by your attendance at this conference, are making a significant statement of your wish and desire to proactively work to create a better and fairer world, one that might meet the criteria of a real republic. May I wish you every success in your important work. Guim gagra agus bannacht ar an obair a megar siúl agi, san cógáilte agus don tácaí. Ber bannacht. and those who, in various capacities, work so hard to improve the landscape for our travelling community. I include among those Owen Ward, who is NUIG's first full-time traveller education officer, and President Ciarán Ó hÓgartaigh, Míle Buíochas, who is such a strong advocate of traveller access to education, and all of your good selves who, by your attendance at this conference, are making a significant statement of your wish and desire to proactively work to create a better and fairer world, one that might meet the criteria of a real republic. May I wish you every success in your important work. Guim gagra agus bannacht ar an obair a megar siúl agi san cógáilte agus don tácaí. Ber bannacht.
We're very grateful to the President for this very thought-provoking and challenging statement. And we note also his references to traveller cultural achievement, and this is something we hope to pursue in our deliberations also. And we turn now to, we'll now turn to another message from Ciarán Ó hÓgartaigh, the President of NUI Galway, who, as President Higgins has mentioned, has been a staunch ally and supporter of travellers in education.
So, tá mai an bhuic díobh as an deise hort an bheilibh aniu ag seoladh an cógáil seo. I'm very pleased to be with you today at the launch of this conference on Irish travellers, Mincéirs in the state since its inception. Very important part of our Decade of Centenaries, because I think very often these celebrations and these commemorations are about what was seen as the official state, and the places like Dublin Castle and the Easter Rising and those events which really transformed the state. But also there are other lived experiences which I think in historical research are becoming more and more important for us. Those lived experiences of ordinary people, of our people. And I think in particular today's conference is recognising the contribution and the impact of the state and the workings of the new state on a very important community in Ireland, Irish travellers, Mincéirs. And I'm particularly pleased at NUI Galway that we're leading out on this. We have many initiatives which welcome travellers to NUI Galway, which challenge us sometimes, and rightly challenge us to do better. And in the context of, I think, a reflection on the state's role, I think similarly we need to reflect, as Michael D. Higgins did when he was here on Traveller Ethnicity Day, on the challenges still ahead of us, the unacceptable context in which and setting in which many Irish travellers still live, and the unacceptable experience that's still there in society. NUI Galway should lead in reflecting on this, making a difference and acting on it. And as University President, I'm particularly pleased today to be with you in that reflection and in that consideration, and hopefully also in doing better in the context of the experience that we offer. It's very much in line with our values: respect for everybody in our community, respect for each other, openness to everybody. And I've often said this, that this university, when I was growing up, where I grew up 10 minutes away, was part of my landscape, part of my furniture. And as University President, I'd like that to be the same for everybody, that everybody feels welcome here, that everybody feels that this university belongs to them. And we do that through excellence and high quality of engagement, and the high quality of work that we do, and that Irish travellers bring to our university as well. And often I also say that communities which are underrepresented allow us to learn from them. And I'd particularly like to thank the Irish traveller community and our Irish traveller students for all the learnings you give us, all that you teach us about your culture, how it is challenging and an opportunity for you to navigate this university, and how we can do better and be a better place as a consequence. we are better because you are here. And we sustain one of our other values. We sustain future generations of research, of scholarship, of communities, of people, of families, and of experience through these particular projects and initiatives. And I'm particularly pleased, therefore, that we're leading out on it. I'd like to thank John Cunningham, buchas de John, agus dar golake illig occur on Ógáid seo le chéile. Gomininic is daine dhéanaan an difriocht, agus tá daine déanamh an difriocht iniu. Daine atá chur imeachtaí mar seo bun, agus daine atá ling freisin mar scoláirí mar vicléin mar lucht fórne, and tá mí don bhuaictíh tuis sin. So for respect, for openness, for excellence and sustainability, thank you all. We will all learn from each other, as we always do, and it's a privilege that we have you here among us today, and this conference and seminar ongoing. Gurmín Mágaibh, thank you.
We're very grateful for the President's message of support, Tá McDonagh bhuaictíad, and we look forward to ongoing good working relations and to promote traveller education in the university. So now we come to the formal launch of the conference, and this is to be done by Senator Eileen Flynn, who was appointed to the Seanad in June 1920. She was the first traveller in the Oireachtas, and hopefully not the last. Eileen grew up on a halting site in Ballyfermot, and she has spoken of the very strong sense of community on the site. After secondary school, which she found quite difficult for various reasons, she went on to study social care in Ballyfermot College of Further Education, and she studied for her BA in Community and Youth Work in Maynooth. She's worked with the National Traveller Women's Forum and Ballyfermot Traveller Action Programme. She's campaigned on homelessness, same-sex marriage, abortion and hate crime. Elected to the chair of the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Key Issues Affecting Travellers, she had an important role to play in this study, which investigated health, education, housing and employment issues. And in terms of reaching a younger audience, she did a really interesting short piece for the homeschool hub, telling a younger audience about traveller life, as well as providing good advice for youngsters. I would advise you all to have a look at this online. And I think it's a really good way of breaking down barriers between travellers and the self community. But I now want to call on Eileen Flynn to launch the conference.
Thanks so much, Mary. I'm delighted to be at this important launch today. And, like we're marking 1922 to 2022, the struggle for equality. And actually, that's exactly what it is for the traveller community, for our community, is a struggle for equality. We kind of wonder, will we ever be will we ever be able to get the opportunity to play an equal part within our society? So I want to thank Galway University, Dr. Harris, Dr. Casey for hosting the launch, Patrick Nevin, and also for Michael D. Higgins for his remarks, and all the speakers who will be taking part today, and of course the artists as well within our community who will be taking part today, and people reading out some what I'm sure will be heartfelt quotes as well. Just to say, like we're looking at 100 years of the state, if you want, 100 years of the Dáil, of the Seanad, and of course the president as well, the three houses of the Oireachtas. And I think it's a very important subject for us all. I just think this can be a time, and anniversary times is a time to look back, but it's also a time to look at how we got to where we are today as a community of people, and then also, of course, a time to look forward to. I've been in the Dáil, I've been in the Seanad since 2020, which will be coming up to 2 years now on the 27th of June. I've sat on the Special Traveller Committee, and the Special Traveller Committee did some work, but that committee has been set up since 2019. And the work of the committee, as was rightly said, was looking at recommendations with the community around health, including physical and mental health, education, employment and accommodation. And as the President rightly said, you know, when we fail to deliver and traveller education and accommodation and equal access to health services, when we fail our community, when we are failed, nobody is held to account. Nobody has to answer for those failures of our community. So there's 84 recommendations within the Special Traveller Committee report. These recommendations are not new recommendations. A lot of people here today would have been part of negotiations around recommendations that we need as a community to go forward. And of course, the accommodation is one, having appropriate, sustainable accommodation for members of our community. And then, you know, again, in the Dáil, when I addressed the Dáil here on the 3rd of March, which was a start date for not only for me as a person, obviously, but for our community and for the state, you know, some of the, we do have all the legislation in the world, and we have some good legislation in Ireland that would bring about a better life quality for our community. We also have some very negative legislation that's there for everybody to see, like the Itinerant Report of 1963. And, you know, myself and Patrick Nevin was having a conversation around this report going back about 2 weeks ago, and I was saying to him, you know, Patrick, we should get rid of that report and see, can we wipe it off the internet completely? And it was very daunting when he said to me, no, Eileen, you know, that's something that we can keep in our history. It's something that it's evidence of how we've been treated as a community for decades after decades. So and I tend to agree with Patrick that we leave it there to remind us of the ill treatment, of the inequalities that us as a community has suffered underneath the laws, the hands of the Irish state, if you want. And what we're looking for, and this conference today, and the conference obviously in the 16th of September, is looking for to be part of society, to get institutions to change towards us as a community, to gather information, to gather all of the papers that was ever wrote about members of the traveller community. So we're calling out to academics, to travellers ourselves, to traveller allies, to traveller activists, to gather all this information and to bring it to the conference in September that will be held, so that we can have all of that information as a community. You know, I said in my remarks to the Dáil that us as a community, we make up less than 1% of the population. We wouldn't even fill Croke Park on an All-Ireland Day, you know, and yet we are the most hated group of people within the Irish society, and ill-treated by services, by departments, by governments, you know. And again, Mary, the answers are there. It's around implementation. We've been failed as a community in our programme of government. The programme of government, it says that we're going to have a standalone traveller mental health strategy. That's nowhere to be seen. It's you know, so I don't believe the political will is still there today, but I think I do genuinely think us coming together as a community, us being part and trying to make our way into big spaces like the Dáil, like the Seanad, like local elections, will give us a platform as a community to move forward, because we're not less. And President Higgins rightly said it, you know, and we're able to call ourselves a republic, but yet we exclude the Irish travellers. And a woman once said to me a few weeks ago, you know, Eileen, she said, traveller community were the only community in Ireland that didn't give up their pride. And what she meant by that was, you know, we stuck with each other. We stuck to our to our culture, and you know, we're resilient as a community of people, and I think that's very evident within our society. And just want to say, you know, I hope people will reflect on legislations that I'd mentioned, like the 1963 report and the reports that we have even today, and look at where we were and how strong we have become as a community of people. I see traveller women such as, you know, Anne-Marie Quigley. I see traveller men like Owen Ward, many more traveller men, just to name two, really strong young traveller activists coming out, speaking up, and being part of and putting themselves in situations where we wouldn't usually put ourselves in as members of the traveller community due to fear. So again, you know, I just think it's important for me now to kind of finish up and say, as like racism and discrimination is part of our system. Our system has been built around racism and discrimination towards us as a community. It's normal, as many people would know around this table here this morning, it's absolutely normal to be racist towards the traveller community. There's no consequences for being racist towards us as a community. It's what you call daily banter. We mean no harm in it. And myself and Patrick, again, coming up to this event, had many discussions, you know, around even right now, we're not even where a few years ago we were looking at an apology from the state. And right now, all we want is equality from the state. And we think 100 years on from the formation of the state, to have one member of the traveller community in our parliament is not enough. What we need is to lift travellers up, give travellers a hand up, support us to perform, because we can perform, we are professionals within Irish society, and support us to be, even though we're proud people, but to be prouder people of who we are today. And just even to note, Dr. Cindy Joyce getting the role that she's got in Limerick University is absolutely remarkable. There is remarkable stuff that's happening with the traveller community and traveller people in their own right, individuals within our own right, putting ourselves into these spaces and no longer being afraid. And that for me is power within itself. And again, I hope it doesn't take another 100 years to get somebody else from the traveller community also elected to our houses. And also, I hope that we never, and I know this, I hope that going in even to 2023, that things can only get better for our community. I hope that with all my heart, because if I look back at our history and our past, things can't get any worse than what it has been. So I like to think that the road we have ahead of us as a community, working with the European Union, working with people, that our future, our children's future, hopefully will be better. So with that said, I would like to officially launch the conference, the struggle for equality, marking 1922 to 2022. And yeah, so I would just like to launch that, launch the conference. And, you know, just to say before I finish that, we are not the problem. You know, we as a community are not the problem. We as a community, we're not the issues. You know, a lot of the time we speak about traveller issues, we're not the issue. The issue is our system. The issue is our previous government, our government today. The issues is the people in power. It's not us as a community. The racism, the discrimination, the hatred has to stop within our society. And it's the big people at the top that has the power to change that, not us as a community. So we have to work with people to be able to change that. Thank you, and thanks to everybody for today. So it's the launch. I've officially launched the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Flynn. We're delighted, of course, that you have this position in the Seanad. I'm sure you'll be able to contribute a lot to improving the situation of travellers and also in breaking down barriers in the years ahead. So we wish you all the best, and we're very grateful to you for being here this morning, because we know that you have a busy schedule. So thank you very much. Okay, so we have a number of other events before we move to the panel discussion. So next I'd like to call on, let's see, on Rosalie Mcdonough. We've had to make some adjustments to the running order because of people's busy schedules. Rosaleen, are you in a position to go ahead now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, very good. So let me just introduce Rosaleen, who is a really extraordinary person. I was at her session on Court yesterday, the Court Festival, where she was interviewed, and it was really quite an amazing experience listening to her. It was profound, provocative, frank, funny, and deeply human. These are the thoughts going through my head at the time. But Rosaleen has an interesting background. She was born in Sligo, one of 20 children. She went on and did a BA in Biblical and Theological Studies and an MPhil in Race, Ethnic and Racial Studies, another MPhil in Creative Writing, and has a PhD from Northumbria University. So she must be one of the most educated people listening in here. Her dissertation was called From Shame to Pride: The Politics of Disabled Traveller Identity. She's a member of the Pavey Point Traveller and Roma Centre, and she was appointed as Commissioner to the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission in 2020. She's published a number of plays. Last year, she published Unsettled, a cross between an autobiography and a collection of essays. And it provides a great insight into her perspectives into identity, community, and physical challenges. She says that writing saved her, just quote, and I'm sure many other writers might identify with this: writing is a gift that has saved me from myself. Practicing and redoing, searching for the essence is often like fishing, searching for the salmon, but finding a nest of eels. Patience is the best attribute that any writer can hope to cultivate. So without further ado, I hand over to Rosaleen.
Thank you, Mary. And indeed, thank you to Patrick Nevin, who invited me to read one of my poems. And before I start, I'd like to say it's so refreshing and really important that Senator Eileen Flynn used the word racism rather than some other metaphor which doesn't describe our history and our relationship with the state. I would also like to take the opportunity in terms of solidarity and love, wish Roma and other travellers and Sintis around the world happy Traveller and Roma Day. And we are particularly reminded of Roma in the Ukraine and how they're suffering, and I hope, along with other travellers and Roma here in Ireland, that they will find safe refuge and that humanitarian agencies won't forget about Roma. Okay, thank you. My poem, I'm not your anchor. Thinker, the old description. Itinerant, the idiom. Knacker, a whispered taunt. Avo, hoary, marry, knacker. The schoolyard, a kick, a shove, a thump. Consistent, predictable, knacker. We oscillate in and out of the historian's pleasure. We are the nuisance he cannot account for. our shadowy presence viewed through the taper, viewed through a lens tapered and rigid. Our algorithms romanticized, simplified through the lingering, settled gaze, the legacy of misfits. Our task: assimilate, absorb, evaporate. Your task: reduce, essentialize, and reject. Constant surveillance, curiosity versus accuracy, veneration versus abomination. Your pernicious attention, wanting the exotic, the worthy, one voice, one image, an emblem. Your fear, contamination. Family, heritage, identity, the beat of our culture belongs to our children. Armored with pride, their dance is one of resilience, resistance, and representation. The pendulum that swings and flashes, they are our strength, our voice, our integrity, our survival. Official ethnic status. This new embrace is choking. My gazing gauze plagues me. Spaceless, motionless, damaged. Scabs of neglect, delicate, riddled with rage, wordless. This colonialized body, profiled, policed, and politicized. On the outskirts of the town, next to a landfill, pushing us to the edge of a road, the edge of a queue, the edge of a sentence. The traveller evaporates, the knacker remains.
Thank you very much, Rosaleen. That was very moving and very challenging indeed. If any of you would like to find this again, you'll find it in Rosaleen's book, Unsettled, which is a very, very profound reflection on Rosaleen's views and feelings and experiences. So again, Unsettled is the book. She didn't ask me for commission for advertising this or anything, but thanks very much, Rosaleen. Okay, now we move to Owen Ward. Again, we have rejigged this slightly because a number of our participants are very busy, including Owen, who's going on to another commitment very shortly. Owen Patrick Ward is an Irish traveller, a graduate of NUI Galway and Traveller Education Officer in the university. He's a member of the Higher Education Authority Athena Swan Intersectionality Working Group. And in his role in the university as Traveller Education Officer, he seeks to encourage and empower travellers to enter higher education and to identify barriers to their access. He was elected to Údarás na hOllscoile in 2020-2021, the first Irish traveller elected to University Governing Authority in Ireland. He is committed to advancing equality, diversity and an inclusion agenda and widening participation from those members of disadvantaged groups. He played a key role recently in organising the week-long Traveller Ethnicity programme, which was launched at the beginning of the week by Michael D. Higgins. And today Owen is going to talk about the call for papers and the call for participation for this conference. Right, Owen.
Thank you very much, Mary, for that. And firstly, I'd just like to say how really honoured I am to be here today, not just only as the Traveller Education Officer at NUI Galway, but also as an Irish Traveller man who has been a past student of the History Department here at NUI Galway. So just with regards to call of papers, for me, when this conference came about and when I listened to the conversation, I think what was very core for me when I was approached to sit on the committee was that the traveller voice itself would be core to all the actions and to all the actions, but also that this conference itself will create a platform where the traveller voice, which was often ignored, erased, and would be put front and centre. So what we're looking for, what's in core and embedded within this call for participation, is that we want to hear from the lived experiences of the traveller community themselves. As you can see there, I won't read it out. The call for participation itself will be opening, and we're looking at a 2-day conference in September 2022. In addition to that, there will be 5 different categories, which will look at historical, cultural, social issues, comparative issues, and psychological issues. And for me, when you look at there, you can see all the different subtitles. But I think one thing again, just to look at what we're really hoping for this call participation is that, you know, I hear at NUI Galway, respect, openness, and excellence is what guides our work, both myself and my colleagues, but also our community here at NUI Galway and how we interact with other communities through our work outside of campus. And I think one thing that these core values would ensure for us is that when it comes to working with the traveller community, that they are at the forefront, and the traveller community voice, that they are respected, that we're very open, and that we can have honest conversations. And again, going back to excellence of how we can ensure that the traveller voice, not only the traveller voice and participation, not only is in one element of the university here at NUI Galway, but is deeply embedded across different facets such as widening participation, student experience, and teaching and learning. And I have no doubt that this call for participation will go a long way to supporting us with that. I just want to say, when we look at who we want to make submissions to this for this call, we would like to receive some from academics, but you do not have to be an academic to make a submission. What we're looking for is students, members of the traveller community, traveller organisations, traveller allies. You know, we're looking for everybody. You don't have to have a PhD, a master's, an undergraduate degree. You can be, you know, we want to hear your voice. We want to ensure that you, as the traveller, if you feel that you can make a contribution to these topics or to topics that are not covered here today, that we want you to get in touch with us, and we will work with you to ensure that we will be able to support you, that you will be represented. Your voice and your lived experience will be represented throughout this very important, impressive, and transformative work. Again, I want to thank everybody from those from behind the scenes. I know how hard this is and a lot of work that's gone into it. And again, as a traveller man who firmly believes in the importance of our traveller identity, our traveller history, and our traveller culture, and it's something that is an anchor for me and an anchor for a lot of others. It's absolutely a privilege to be here today to announce this call for participation. So Mary, I'll keep it nice and short, and thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Owen. That's exactly what we want, of course. So we hope that we will have a very good turnout at the event in September, and that this will be very good from an academic point of view, from an activist point of view, and also, of course, the interaction between a wide range of people. So thanks, Owen. We know you're rushing away to another commitment also. Okay, now we come to a musical treat with Trisha Reilly. Trisha Reilly of the Leitrim Reillys. And Trisha's been a traveller activist for over 30 years. She's a great believer in travellers' self-determination, in travellers taking the driving seat in the cause of justice and equality for their own community. She set up the first Traveller Development Project in the Athlone area back in 1999. It's now under Westmeath Community Development. However, Trisha's contribution here today is as singer-songwriter. All her family are musical, but her greatest musical influences were her parents, particularly her father. Many of the songs were carried down through her family for generations, and many have been recorded by Professor Tom Munnelly, who got some of them from John Jack O'Reilly. And these are now available in the Irish Traditional Music Archives. And Trisha also writes her own songs, generally relating to her own life's experiences, and she enjoys writing poetry and short stories. She spent a number of years working specifically with travellers in residential care under the HSE, where she believes they were overrepresented. Her song Broken Lines, which you're about to hear, is inspired by the impact of forced assimilation and the attempt to alienate her from her roots, which she fought against when she was in care. So now we hand over to Trish.
Hi, I'd like to thank Patrick Neville for inviting me to this event today. This particular song I'm going to sing is called Broken Lines, and it's about the assimilation of coming from the traveller community into the settled community, and the broken lineage there. And of course, when I was taken into care, I was 8 years of age. That was back in 1981. It was a process that took place as a result of the state's 1963 report, which said they would get rid of the itinerant problem, but they haven't got rid of me. The final solution, 1963, to get rid of a problem of itinerancy. Indigenous people who were born to be free, denied recognition of their ethnicity.
We seem to be having a volume problem.
Broken homes, broken hearts, broken truths, they make for bad starts. Shattered dreams and broken minds. You can't bridge the distance between those broken lines. Those broken lines, those broken lines. They undersize you, they won't recognize you. They paralyze you, the distance between those broken lines. You lose your direction on a one-way track, but you keep on moving because you can't get back. And it makes no difference, now you can read the signs. When you can't bridge the distance between those broken lines. Temperature changes, you're hot and you're cold. You don't know your value, 'cause you've been bought and sold. As soon as you're in, you're told to go out. And it's those broken lines I'm talking about. those broken lines undersize you, won't recognize you, they paralyze you, the distance between those broken lines. Not how you play, if it's on the cards, you're gonna be always a joker, never the queen of hearts, always a loser, and you can never win. And that traveler stamp will always be your sin. Those broken lines, those broken lines, they'll undersize you, and they won't recognize you, and they'll paralyze you, the distance between those broken lines.
That was great indeed, Trisha. We were very grateful to you for participating in this with a very soulful and indeed a very relevant song. And we hope to hear more from you in the future. Now we move on to the second part of our event this morning. This is the panel discussion, which is going to be introduced by Vincent Browne. Now, Vincent Browne himself probably needs no introduction to many listeners. He's a veteran journalist, editor, broadcaster with exceptionally wide experience, having contributed to a wide range of newspapers over the years: the Irish Press, Evening Press, Sunday Press, Evening Herald, Sunday Independent, later the Irish Times. He was involved in launching the controversial investigative magazine McGill, which he edited for almost a decade, and he relaunched the Sunday Tribune. However, he was probably best known for his broadcasting, for his radio program Tonight with Vincent Browne, which ran for about a decade, and then this was followed by his television Tonight with Vincent Browne. And some of you, of course, will remember his relentless grilling of his political interviewees. He really left them no place to hide. On his retirement from TV3 in 2017, Bill Malone, director of programming at TV3, commented, and I quote, "Vincent encapsulated the mood of the nation during unprecedented economic and political turmoil. His commitment to highlighting inequality and injustices in Irish life has been unwavering over his journalistic career." So Vincent's highlighting of injustice included many criticisms of prejudice against travellers. He criticised, for example, cuts in the budget for traveller health. He highlighted traveller suicide. He at one point very strongly criticised TV3, his own employer, for their sensational negative coverage of travellers. His ongoing interest in relations with travellers and the settled community is evident in a piece I found online, a recording of an event during Kilkenny Traveller Pride Week in September 2021. This is called The Meaning of Culture, and in conversation, and it highlighted the need for better dialogue. So I hand over now to Vincent, who's going to chair our panel discussion. Thank you. We don't seem to have Vincent's volume.
Okay, I can.
Great.
Thank you, Mary. We are going to have a panel discussion now involving Patrick Nevin, who is a founder or manager of the Tallaght Traveller Community Development Project and has been in that role for 7 years. He has an interest in ancient history and archaeology and holds a degree in history in those subjects from Trinity College Dublin. He has a particular interest in the state's relationship with Traveller Irish community and how we can trace the history of state oppression and the process of othering. Elaine Martin is our next contributor. He's a counselling psychologist currently working in the anti-human team and women's health service for HSE. I hope that isn't a typo of some sort.
It's the anti-human trafficking team. Thank you, Vincent.
I thought you'd come straight from Moscow. Promote. Sorry about that. She has, Elaine has a particular interest in the subject of cultural identity and the Irish psyche in particular. God, you must have an unhappy life thinking about the Irish psyche. But anyway, and Aoife Brenach has published on the history of Irish travellers and is currently making her way through Ireland's censored books. That's another hard chore. Rosemary Marie Mohan was to join us, but she unfortunately is ill. So we start with Patrick, if I may. Ciarán Buckley, by the way, has given me all the questions that I'm to ask, and I'm not allowed to ask any questions of my own of any sort. And if you think that they're bad questions, but it's Ciarán's fault. Sarah's first question is, how significant a role did the Irish state play in anti-traveller racism that is so pervasive in Irish society today? Patrick.
Hi, Vincent. Thanks very much for being here today as well. I just want to fantastic to the contributors earlier on as well. How significant? Well, I mean, there's no doubt, Vincent, that the immediate othering process began as early as 1922 with the Irish state. During that period of the first year of the Free State's existence. And we have accounts, and people like Jane Heliner, anthropologists and others have written over the years extensively about it, the accounts of that process beginning as early as 1922, when travellers were first identified at a local level in terms of urban district councils and local authorities, and a call by and large was sent out by lobbying that was primarily called on by the merchant, I would argue the merchant settled propertier class, for the immediate expulsion or removal of travellers from local areas on the grounds of nuisance and the fear of spreading epidemics. And actually, from that call, by 1925, there was a piece of legislation introduced, the Local Government Act, Section 20, which actually gave local authorities a particular power to evict travellers on those very grounds. Now, what's interesting, and you know, we seem to have this kind of blind spot in Ireland when it comes to travellers, tinker travellers, that the type of cultural racism and racism and othering that we receive is somehow, you know, caused by ourselves for our very existence. But when you look at that piece of legislation that was introduced, it was 8 years ahead of what was to come in Nazi Germany. Now, I know I've said this before and people kind of look at me with an incredulous look on their face. Regardless of how successful that piece of legislation was or wasn't, the very fact that it was put in place less than just over 3 years after the formation of the Irish state gives us an idea of that process of othering that was going to lead, or did lead on to what would be termed legislative cleansing today. And it didn't end because 2002, we had the introduction of the Miscellaneous Trespass Legislation Act, which again was a form of legislative cleansing, which essentially made it nigh and impossible for tinker travellers to practice their nomadic transient lifestyle that had been part and parcel of our entire heritage. So the state bears responsibility, and it should bear responsibility from its inception 100 years ago, because at immediate, when that call went out from the valued classes, as we could term,
the state responded by introducing legislation. And that period of uttering from that piece of legislation continued right through for the next 40 years till we get to the eve of 1960-61 with the creation of the Commission of Itinerancy under the Fianna Fáil government at the time. Yes, it was the Fianna Fáil government at the time, but it's interesting because the Commission on Itinerancy sat for 3 years, and it literally, from the get-go, from its opening lines, it basically stated the absolute, the final solution. And I'm using this language, this is the language in it, the final solution to the itinerant problem. And its primary goal was the complete and utter absorption and assimilation of this itinerant class of people. They also go on to say in that categorically that they weren't going to give recognition, or they had no reason to investigate recognition of ethnicity. Therefore, they weren't going to ask any of the experts in the field of that area. Now, what's important just on that point as well, when that document, the Commission on Itinerancy, was published in '63, there was a seminal piece of work published by Hannah Ardrent, the political sociologist, writer, and so forth. And she published what was then became quite controversial, and some people venerated, others would deride it, but it's The Banality of Evil, on her account of following the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Israel for crimes against humanity. But what's important is the language that is strewn right throughout that report, and that language is the language of othering, and it's the language of oppression. And I would argue, and much more learned than I would argue, that once you have that language of oppression coming from the state institutions and those within this the state, and the runners and the influence of the state, it feeds down into the mindset of the general population. So there's no doubt that the state had a very crucial role and significant role in the creation of anti-traveller rhetoric, anti-traveller sentiment, and indeed the introduction of legislation and so forth. So yeah, the state needs to bear responsibility. Vincent, are you still there?
Yes, I am, yeah.
Yeah, so I would argue that the state needs to bear and needs to own up. And it's interesting, just a point I'd like to make, when Michael D was doing his speech, he talked about our community. And that, to me, is what this conference, the launch of this conference, is about, is we are part and parcel of the branches of what it be Irish identities as opposed to Irish identity. And we need to accept that. And therefore, the state and the institutions that to some extent prop up the existing state need to take ownership and need to take cognizant of their failures in the previous 100 years in relation to the situation for travellers. And, you know, the president and others and Senator Eileen Flynn talked about the inequality that's ingrained within the system. But that inequality also has a detrimental impact on our lives. I mean, we know from the social determinants, the high rate of suicide. We know about the differential or the disparity between a traveller man's life and his longevity comparable to his settled counterpart is 15 years, 11 to 12 years with traveller women. And this is a direct consequence of that othering and racism, and that it ingrains itself, and that bias towards travellers. So the state has a long way to go. And in relation to the ethnic question in 2017, with the acknowledgement, which was welcomed by myself and indeed all the traveller organisation, traveller activists, and indeed traveller allies, which there is quite a lot, and we need to acknowledge that. It needs to be acknowledged that from 63 onwards, they had consistently refused to look at the area of ethnic status for travellers and acknowledgement of it. And it was only that off the back of almost 40 years of traveller activism, going right back to Dublin Travellers Educational Development Group, Mincéirs Mishley, which was founded by Nan Joyce and Thomas McCann and others, and right through to 2017, with international bodies also calling on the Irish state to give recognition to the indigenous ethnic status of travellers, that it came about. But that in itself hasn't changed very much for travellers on the ground. And what we need is a much more hands-on role by the state. And I'm talking about a direct conversation in relation to state an apology, state reparations, right across the board, and engagement with the traveller community on a parity of esteem. And I'll finish with this point, if maybe that's answered some of your question and maybe none of it, but we need to acknowledge those allies, settled allies that have been around for a long, long time, which has impacted on them for their very role in supporting travellers throughout this entire century. And there's been quite a few of them. So I just want to make that point as well. So I don't know if that's answered your question or maybe opened up another debate.
Oddly enough, it has answered the question. And just you made reference to the Commission on Itinerants. There wasn't a single traveller on that commission. I guess
absolutely not.
Right. I was going to. All right, thank you.
But also, Vincent.
Yeah.
Sorry, just one point. I have looked at the makeup of the people on that commission, and they were extraordinary individuals. And particularly Brian Walsh, who was a High Court judge at the beginning, and towards the end of it became a Supreme Court judge. He was also heavily involved in Irish law for the next 40 years, both at a national level and at a European level. We're not talking about, you know, I'm not going to use any type of derogatory language here, but we're not talking about someone that was coming from a limited background. We're talking about extremely well-sourced, well-resourced, and people who should have known better, because the language of that final solution in itself, and with everything that was coming out from post World War II Europe and all of that language was embedded right throughout the document. So just a point there in relation to that, yeah.
All right, thank you, Patrick. We go now to Elaine Martin, who is a counselling psychologist. Elaine.
Thank you, Vincent. Is there a particular question or place you want me to start?
I've got to ask you a question. Sorry about that. Why do you think that racism is such a pervasive feature of Irish society, anti-traveller racism?
It is quite remarkable, isn't it? You know, in a time in this world when we now pick ourselves and each other up on our prejudices, and when we're sensitive to microaggressions, intentional and unintentional, we tolerate outright racism towards travellers, and we're unlikely to be challenged in social situations about it. Also, looking at where we are at this point in our Irish history, you know, we've become so much more aware of historical discrimination in our society, and the oppressive monoculture of the last 100 years that excluded women, excluded their children born out of the institution of marriage, that excluded gay people. We haven't yet asked the question of ourselves about the treatment of travellers. So I don't know why it is that we tolerate this racism, but it is that question that we need to begin with. And I suppose the conference, and one of the aims of the conference, is to create a space for us to reflect on ourselves and to think about what's going on. As a psychologist, I spend my days listening to individual stories and tuning into patterns of relating that are woven through them. And similarly, I've had a strong interest in what I call the Irish psyche over the last 15 years. So I listen to the stories that we tell ourselves in Ireland about ourselves and pick out some of the patterns in it. And I suppose I think it might be useful to think about our racism in the context of our own history. I mean, one of the pervasive stories in the last 25 years that we talk about in our popular narrative is how church and state took over where a colonizer left off. And we talk about, you know, also how we've given ourselves away too cheaply when we talk about our fishing rights or our gas fields. So there's some tacit recognition when we talk about ourselves of dynamics of trauma, you know, that traumatized individuals and citizens are vulnerable to repeated trauma and succumbing to powerful others, and that the oppressed can become oppressor, having only one template for the exercising of power. And as we know, unless you're aware of the risk of repeating the past in one guise or another, then and unless you put systems in place to ensure that it can't happen, then you're really destined to repeat it. So it occurs to me that the way that travellers are positioned by the majority settled population reminds me so much of how Irish people were stereotyped across centuries in America and Britain. And I wonder if having a long-standing victim narrative in here in Ireland, that we don't recognise when we are victimising others. I'll pause there because I don't. You know, you may have some questions arising from that, but certainly one of the ideas I would have is that we, you know, that is culturally informed and informed from an unresolved past, and that is not to excuse it. That is not to give anybody a pass about it. But together with the looking at, I suppose, the treatment of travellers over the last 100 years, which I was unaware of, as I imagine many people are, because it's not taught in history, to my knowledge. But I think about a new state straight out of the trauma of colonization, trying to assert its cultural identity by creating this monoculture and clamping down on anyone who didn't conform, and has succeeded then in the last 100 years of unofficially othering travellers, so that now the settled majority is quite disconnected emotionally and tries to blame travellers for their plight.
Yeah, it is a feature of what we call Irish freedom, that the mass of the population was no better off after we achieved independence than they had been before. And we never saw freedom in the context of equality or respect for others. Would you agree with that?
I think we have I think respect is the word that I would tune into there. I don't think we really have we haven't developed the concept, I think, in Ireland. Because a lot of our maybe obedience or even cooperation, I think, is fear-based, you know, or traditionally was born out of fear as opposed to respect. So again, when you're coming from a past where there has not been any respect, you know, for your personhood, how do you learn it? How do you incorporate it into the agents, you know, into the state bodies? How do you begin to grow it? I think we have a major problem with respect, and we don't see it, but it is what we need to be able to develop towards each other.
All right, we go on. By the way, just before we move from that, you're examining the Irish psyche, and what has that done to your psyche? But apart from that, what significant insights have you acquired?
I think that we carry a lot of shame, and that shame is still a driver in our interpersonal relationships as much as in our international relationships. And because when you dread shame, you are very conscious and sensitive to status and how you're going to appear in the eyes of others. And I think that has led to quite a, you know, the clamping down, that controlling kind of culture that I've described. If you were to make the analogy with a parent, a parent who's quite shame sensitive won't let any of their children do anything that might reflect badly on them. So I think that has sort of represented the kind of state over the last 100 years, in terms of not allowing, people to express themselves, to express their own identity, seeing it all as a reflection on them, and therefore, as I say, not engaging in any kind of respectful relationship, but just a controlling relationship.
You could argue that we don't have enough shame. Like when you think of the treatment of women who in the Magdalene laundries, the people in reformatories that were sexually abused for so long, the treatment of people who had a difficult start in life and we just didn't care. So in ways, we didn't have enough shame.
You've touched on something really important there, which is the psychological legacy of colonization, where we're taking responsibility for things that we don't have responsibility for, and not taking sufficient responsibility for the things that we do. So being quite mixed up about what is our bag and what is not. In this case, and when you think of the word responsibility, the ability to respond, it is the state and it is the people with social power, the settled community who has the ability to respond and the responsibility in this situation to right the injustices towards travellers. And you don't put it on a group of people who are not wielding social power to address the problems.
All right, we move on to Aoife, and Aoife, are you there? I see her on the Aoife. What ethical challenges are there of researching travellers in the archives of the Irish state, and in those of us who are of the settled community, many of us with the mindset, anti-traveller mindset of the settled community? How likely is it that we will be free of bias ourselves?
Well, nobody is ever going to be free of bias. All a researcher can do is know their biases, acknowledge them, own them publicly if necessary. It is important to make your position clear. But I think that the state archives present a huge problem because they are the ones most commonly consulted by historians of modern Ireland under the current way that we do our historiography. So for most people who are trying to do a PhD, that is where they might start to research issues around the relationship between travellers and the settled people. But the state, as has been pointed out by the earlier speakers, the state has its own significant issues with travellers that it has created both structurally and also psychologically in an emotional sense. So the archive itself is therefore going to reproduce how the state sees travellers. And it doesn't reproduce how travellers see themselves or how travellers, might interact with other people without the state's interference. So that is really the biggest problem in addressing how the state treats travellers through its own archive, is that you really do see like a state, you end up reproducing the words of the state, and that has real life effects in Irish society today. So for example, if I wished to talk about how travellers were policed by the state, I would have to use some of the state archive to discuss that. And it could end up being, as I know, if I said to someone what I was trying to write about, that they would then proceed to crack their usual jokes about how travellers are considered inherently violent or feuds or whatever, and these things will come up. So the research that I would do if I said what I was doing would actually validate people's prejudice just by the subject of the research. And that itself is a huge problem when you deal with how methodologies are constructed and how people might go about working in an archive. And I think that that's true whether the researcher is traveller or settled, as in it just feeds into so much that we expect within our prejudices and biases and fears. And the state then, of course, has enacted so much violence against travellers, both bureaucratic and policing. And I think that when you go to use those archives, you know, it's inherently tainted by that violence, just as the archives of the mother and baby homes are tainted by extraordinary levels of misogyny and determination to exclude. So I think that anyone who does research on topics like this needs to really consider the emotional weight of the archive. And it's something that we have tended as a profession to ignore and have just talked about what happened objectively and how it happened and causation, without maybe addressing enough of those kind of issues that are more pertinent to how we may relate to each other today.
An issue that has struck me as being quite important, but not much discussed, has to do with traveller education. And that the experience of many travellers was that they started to go to school in a local national school, and they then had to leave because the Gardaí forced the family to go somewhere else. And they start again, and the same would happen again and again. So that instead of the state adhering to its constitutional requirement to afford education to everybody, including travellers, the state was actually preventing travellers from getting education. I don't know if that's featured much in archives or in the literature on travellers, but it seems to me to be a significant point.
It's something about how the state is able to compartmentalize its responsibilities, and travellers suffer particularly from that. And I think idea scholarship around intersectionality really brings to the fore how, you know, on paper, the government is doing one thing, and then in another section, the government is doing another thing, but they will contradict each other and they will act against each other. And in general, the segments of the government are very distinct, and they will often just hold their hands up and go, well, I'm just doing my job here. And so there is a problem with joined up thinking within institutions. The joined up thinking can often be more accidental, but certainly, you know, those kinds of aggressions that, you know, break community bonds and that displace people, the state is also then operating at a more emotional level there. I think that's the emotional level rather than we look at how it actually works on the ground. Sometimes the legislation and the statutory orders, they're very interesting, but they don't really tell us about the overall impression of policy and how that may have played out. And so the state archives won't be assessing that sort of thing. And that's why you turn to other sources to find out more about how policies impacted people on the ground.
Do the archives of the Gardaí, I don't know if there's such a thing, of the Garda Síochána, reveal anything about the treatment of travellers by the Gardaí?
Well, the archives, it depends on what's available at any given time. When I went looking, there wouldn't be that sort of information. The records to do with courts obviously reveal people going through the court system. But there, you know, it's an entirely different set of policing. You know, once things get to court, it's different to the other form of policing. So there are problems in trying to really quantify these things. And I think that has stopped a lot of historians from engaging with issues around this, that there is a need to be objective and to prove things. But sometimes, you know, we have to understand that even if something isn't there, it's still an important story. The State Archive isn't the only archive or the only articulation of truth and factual information, but that requires perhaps a rethinking in the methodology and in the way that people work. And that does take time because the outputs have to change. And it's part of a lot of issues. And also, of course, travellers themselves are going to bring a different perspective to the State Archive to settle people. People from other immigrant backgrounds coming into Ireland are going to bring new insights, and part of what might be good in terms of how we research the history of travellers and settled people in the future is bringing in more European comparisons, because I think that's a really important way of understanding how it works.
Are there any published insights into how the courts have treated travellers?
Not that I'm aware of at the moment, but I'm open to correction there.
Do you think it would be a productive area of study?
It really depends on the records and the sorts of questions they might answer. And also the fact that it does reproduce placing travellers within a criminality context, which means that people think, well, that's the only way we can study travellers, and that has an impact on travellers today, you know, even if it's a historic past that I would be talking about.
Okay, let's discuss among our three panelists the issues raised by others. Patrick, do you want to comment on anything said by your two colleagues? Am I
just aware that Rosalie wanted to get a question in there?
Okay, Rosalie,
okay.
go ahead.
I will. There is just a point I'd like to. But
okay.
Thank you, Patrick.
I can't hear Rosalie.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm no historian, but I remember when I was doing my undergrad, we had a very good Protestant man who always used to say, history is one damn thing after another. We only need the facts. We don't need the narratives. And I mean, again, I'm not a historian, but I do feel that Irish history has become reductive. For a long time, it was about sectarianism, and that was the only flash point. Northern Ireland, and who know what Irish identity mean. And I remember many years ago, as a young woman, I was at a wedding in an Ulster Hall near the Shank Road. In those days, travellers didn't have access to hotels, so we were lucky to have a community hall that would allow our family in. And again, it was right in the heartland of Orangeism. But it was the only one available and the only one that would take us. But anyway, after the singing and the dancing and the crying and the roaring, and the DJ said, now we all stand up for Iran the Green. And obviously I don't stand, but I have a chair that rises up. But I found myself not wanting to rise up or hold my head up. And I remember one of my aunts came up behind me and pulled the plait of my hair and she said, "Do you not feel proud of your Irish identity?" And I said, no. I said, I feel like what Elaine said, I feel estranged. I feel I'm psychologically in a constant on-off relationship with my Irish identity. I feel that I have to constantly, in order to search for traveller identity, I have to go beyond the reductive settled. No disrespect historians. I also believe it's only in recent times that material narrative of our lives, I mean, that's how the laundry story was exposed. It was because of hurt and pain. It wasn't because, and also money and land, as usual, and land in terms of travellers is an area that hasn't been looked at in terms of the rezoning of land in the 80s and the 90s. But I suppose what I'm trying to grasp and unravel and contribute is that given all that's gone before us, not just as travellers, but as an Irish woman, as a disabled woman, as someone who I still struggle with that Irish history is meaningless to me. I know we have stories of traveller men and women in the resistance in World War I and 1916, but that sense of not having history officially recognized is very disturbing and psychologically painful. You know, you can't find yourself anywhere other than the appendix or recently I'm involved under the role of Hannah McGinley, who's doing stuff on the curriculum in Irish history. And I remember thinking, somebody said it's too dangerous to talk about the effects of evictions on travellers because it would damage the psyche of young traveller children. And that may well, like, I'm not a historian or a psychologist. No, they may well be true, but what I would say is, having lived through several evictions, even that in itself warrants a historical documentation of how, why, where, and the aftermath. I mean, people love the sensational men in Bellatabas, the local authority, the bulldozers, but they're never that interested in what happens after the, you know, if you live through 8 or 9 evictions, your head is just melted, if I can use that casual word. So I suppose I'm nervous of history. I'm nervous of trying to rewrite history with us in it. I'm also very nervous about what we're going to find. What are the stories we don't know? What stories or what elements of history did our ancestors die and we don't know about? Anyway, I'm sorry if I'm cynical and
I think that's a fascinating point, a fascinating issue which I never thought about before. Does any other panelists want to comment on that?
Can I just briefly say
Yes,
that
sure.
I don't think history can do the work that people expect it to do a lot of the time. I think that it's, you know, there are lots of histories out there, but when people say history, they often somehow imagine a book that documents some objective truth that we will all agree with. And I don't think that that's the way history will work. And I don't think it is the way that it does work. it's the state that's perpetuating this idea of history as explaining the birth of the state. But the people existed before the state, and the people existed in many different ways that the state cannot acknowledge and will not acknowledge. And so because the state has co-opted the history of Ireland as Ireland the state, rather than Ireland the people and all the languages within it, I think that that's the problem we have with history. And so it isn't going to bear the weight, our current understanding of history isn't going to bear the weight of the broadening of it. But I think in the future, there are other ways of doing it. Scholars of other countries are producing work that is very innovative when they are faced with problems of extreme power imbalance. And I think that's what Irish historians need to look at, and everybody else.
Patrick, do you want to respond to this issue?
Yeah. Yeah, no,
Patrick,
I
do you
just
want
to come in
that?
a couple of points into history. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, you can, yeah. Go ahead, yes.
Yeah, you can hear me. Yeah. No, I was just a couple of points I want to come in on, and obviously listening to Rosaleen as well, and just in terms of that disconnect from Irish history. I mean, I've studied history myself in Trinity, and I've always been a huge fan of it, and I've just been absorbed with it. But I have the same disconnect. There's this psychological disconnect from this state. I have no loyalty to the state that is Ireland as the 26 counties republic. I mean, my loyalty is to the landmass where I was born and where I came from and where my people originated from. But in terms of the institutions or the state itself, I mean, it really wouldn't matter, or it doesn't matter to me. Now, I know other travellers would completely disagree with me, and indeed rightly so, but it really doesn't matter what flag flies over Dáil Éireann, whether that's the tricolour or the Union Jack or whatever may come down in future generations. But I just want to make that point. But just in terms of Aoife was saying there, just around the I suppose, the issues when one is investigating or researching or looking at the archival material of the state when it comes to its engagement or its relationship with travellers, and how looking through that lens, or the lens that's there because it's naturally biased. I believe that in itself is worth its weight in gold in terms of getting that out. And I would call on historians, particularly across the board, to look at particularly the itinerancy. I mean, Senator Eileen Flynn, she referenced a discussion we had a couple of weeks back in terms of the Commission on Itinerancy and its place. I solidly believe that's a document, and it needs to be referenced in every educational and every archival material when we're discussing the last 100 years of the formation, from the formation of the Irish state to the present, and its movement and its progress, as they would say, because that document in itself put to paper the absolute mindset in itself. It has to be researched, it has to be documented, and it has to be investigated. But the key for me is that the narrative itself can be separate from the actual material and the relationship that the state has with travellers, and how it has butchered, I would argue, the traveller community for this last 100 years, but particularly in its first 40 years, from 22 to 61, how it initiated that process of othering, and that which then fed into the mindset of the majority population. And that's the way I look at it. We can't remove the wrongs that the state have committed onto travellers, and we may not be able to address. And I'm not looking, I'll just finish with this point, Vincent. I'm not calling on going back to some kind of pre-1922 rose-tinted look at Irish travellers or traveller Irish and thinkers and romanticism and all of that. We're never going back there. But what we can do is we can record that oppression, and we can publicize that, and it can be on the libraries, and it can be in the archival material. And we need the historians from the majority population, which is, at the moment, we don't have enough travellers. We're not at a critical mass level to have our own archivists, researchers, historians, but we need them to take a lead role in relation to this material and making sure that it is available to the general population, both traveller and non-traveller. And just a point in relation to Elaine, in terms of that monocultural mindset or that monocultural project, make no bones about it. And I've discussed it with some historians over the years, and a lot, as I said earlier on, a lot more learned than I'll ever be. But it was a monocultural project that started off in 22, and anyone that they deemed of none value to state, and that we know that from the women's history, we know it from working class history, and so forth. But we don't know it as much in terms of traveller history, and that's that intersectionality that was discussed earlier on needs to, and that's where we will get some of the answers. And history itself, doesn't give you any answers for the future, as they say, but at least it will be there, and at least we as a people will be recognized that we have consistently been resilient with the face of the state coming at us with all its agency to literally rid the Irish environment of tinker travellers. And I think that's what's important.
There's an issue about travellers which arose in, I think, in the early 90s or mid 90s, or maybe it's the early 90s, and it's to do with the murder of John Ward. Was it John? Was his first name? In Mayo, a traveller in Mayo, by a farmer, Nally. I've forgotten his first name too. And the facts of that case seem to me to be uncontroversial, that this man was murdered. And so the High Court judge that heard the case in the first instance thought, but there was an outcry and there was an appeal, and not alone was the murder verdict set aside, and you would have thought, well, maybe a manslaughter, which I thought would be ridiculous. But the guy got off completely. And it seemed to me that this was symptomatic of a deep-rooted bias in the legal system against travellers that was really quite startling, involving the murder of a human being. Elaine, do you have any comment to make on that?
Not on the legal system, Vincent. However, I do think we need to create room at the conference for that look back on the legal system, both the decisions that are made in court and the patterns in sentencing towards travellers. So I think those biases ought to be documented and brought to the conference, as much as we're focusing on other areas of history or education, mental health, which would be my own area. And we need to focus on the legal system too.
Just one other issue, maybe if you would like to come to, and it's to do with private property. Private property is the sacrosanct thing. The necessity for a family of travellers to live somewhere in some kind of decent circumstances is trumped again and again by the demands of private property. That seems also to convey to me a deep antipathy to travellers in the, well, not just travellers, in our legal system.
Yes, there is a huge number of institutional biases within the system that are then turned against people who are the most unpopular and the most marginalized. And I suppose in searching for the historical evidence of that, it might be difficult to come up with the numbers, but I think it's always very important to talk about how things feel and how we know that there's more going on than on the surface. We're all very familiar with the official explanation for the denial of planning permission. But, you know, in our own lives, we know what's going on in the background. And I think that that is part of the limits of the archive. It might not be there in the archive, but it might be there in hints in the newspaper, in various strange leading questions and local authority discussions. So it's really about constructing a narrative out of things that perhaps in the past, the historical practice, the traditional academic historical practice might not have given a lot of weight to that. But I think that the methodologies are improving.
And finally, with regard to the point made by Rosalie, she said that she was not interested in Irish history, partly because Irish history ignored the existence of travellers very largely. Isn't she right?
I don't blame her. You know, there's a lot of Irish history that is very focused on, you know, one or two big narratives, you know, the achievement of independence and how that was brilliant, and then how brilliant everybody was not to turn fascist and go to war. Like, these are the big stories. You know, they're important, but they're not the only stories. Like the work I'm doing on censorship at the moment is about the paranoia of the 1920s and this really extraordinary fear of all sorts of things, which ties into what Elaine was saying about the Irish psyche and the various ways that it was trying to create a monoculture. You know, that is a really important part of the Irish historical narrative. But if we celebrate the foundation of the state, obviously that's not a part of that narrative, because we're saying we achieved independence and we instantly became extremely paranoid.
Okay, it's 1 minute to 12, and we'll just go for final comments. Elaine, do you want to make a comment generally on what has been discussed?
I'm delighted that we are speaking across disciplines, because psychology doesn't have the answer, history doesn't have the answer, and there's so many, sociology doesn't have the answer, but together sharing and weaving narratives into history and looking from human rights perspectives as well on where we're at now. I suppose I've great hope that the conference that we're launching today, that will take place in the autumn, will allow for much deeper discussion and bring maybe new stories to light for the Irish public to reflect on.
Okay, Patrick. And make final.
Yeah, no, I would agree with everything that's been said. Yeah, no, I would agree with everything that's been said. I mean, I do think, you know, after 40 years of traveller activism, traveller organisations at a human rights level and community level, when we look at the stats in relation to travellers across the social determinants, we do need the state and the institutions of the state right across the different disciplines to really step up to the mark. It's 100 years since the formation of the state. Now the state needs to make its mark, because the greatest stain on the Irish state since its foundation is the absolute treatment and butchery of travellers in that 100 years. And I think that's where I would like to see the discussion go as well, in terms of that. That's my point.
Do you want to make a final comment? Or have you made it?
I think I've made it. Yeah, I'm grand.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Okay, Vincent, if you can
I've learned a lot from this myself.
We have a number of questions coming in on Q&A here, and one from questions and comments. One from Martin Collins. The state must accept the role it played in association with the Catholic Church in othering and legitimizing racism and pursuing the elimination and genocide of our people. We need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and truth being the key word our history needs to be heard. And we can't have, essentially, that we can't have healing without reconciliation and until the truth is actually heard. So do you think do people like to comment on the idea of truth here and the role of the church in this?
Mary, do you mean we can go on for another hour?
Perhaps we could have 10 minutes for a few quick questions if you would all stay.
Okay, anybody want to respond to that?
Well, I do honestly think that something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a much better option than anything we've tried before. We don't need any more commissions, and we don't need any more government reports. I think that the problem with what we're doing is we are repeating the same mistakes because we're using the same formats. And the way we deliver and discuss the results of our deliberations, that affects them. So we need to change the format. We need to change how people engage with whoever is going to be, you know, sitting on one side of the table and the other. We need to just change all of that. And I think that that will change then how things like history and sociology and psychology work. And so it feeds back in. And that seems to me a more important thing than maybe writing another history book, which might just reproduce, you know, some of those things, or another commission, which is an inadequate response. So yeah, I think that is a really valid point.
Yes, indeed. Another comment here: no more research on travellers. There's research after research for this purpose, but no government actions. Weasley words, promising action maybe, but no real action. Does ongoing research facilitate the government doing nothing? Action delayed because the state is awaiting another piece of research. So I think a lot of people would agree with this. A question here: would anyone like to comment on the difference between assimilation and integration, and if integration is desirable? That's a huge question.
Okay, Patrick.
Yeah, well, the definition of assimilation is the complete removal of a people's identity. That's what I would argue. Integration is about, if we're coming from in terms of travellers, being integrated into the society, the dominant society, but integrated on a parity of esteem, where there's due recognition given to one's heritage, one's culture, one's place in society, and that is being supported. So that's the simple definition for me. Assimilation is the complete and utter absorption of a group, and in most cases a minority in that case, when it comes to travellers. So that's what I would see the difference between, unless there's someone who wants to say different.
Is a focus on identity problematic, in that perhaps it would be better captured by a focus on equality?
May I say something here,
Yeah.
Vincent? I think when we think about the concept of identity, we think about something fixed. But identity isn't fixed. It's actually quite, it can change across time. It can change with the expression of, you know, your gender, your class. So, and it can become tight, and it can become loose at different points in history too. So, and when a culture is under pressure, identity becomes very tight. You know, I know when my father was growing up, you couldn't be Irish and support and play soccer. You know, now you can be Irish and, you know, wear a soccer jersey on a Saturday and your GAA jersey on a Sunday, and your cultural identity isn't compromised by the fact that you've loosened the tent. So I don't think there's a problem with cultural identity per se, and certainly solutions that have been looked at, you know, in Northern Ireland and in other places in the past, which is maybe to deny cultural identity or to play it down, doesn't work in terms of allowing integration. In fact, it's about being able to be together, you having your identity, me having mine, and respecting that. So equality needs to be in the equation, but not to the loss of cultural identity necessarily.
There's a response here to
Am I allowed to say something? Can I say something?
Rosaleen.
First of all, I agree with Eileen around identity being fluid and probably, although not always context-based, but again, I'm not sure about that. And what I would say about the economy of interculturalism and assimilation, for me, I don't like either of those words. I would like the words respect, recognition, and that we hold a space within that linear dialogue about holding a space for diversity. And I'm not just talking about African Day or, a Chinese New Year. I'm talking about having something that's much more sustainable, and that traveller culture and identity is somehow enshrined, if not in law, but in the Irish Psyche, that there needs to be a whole paradigm shift in terms of how we talk, how we write, and how we remember travellers, and how we, I suppose, make room in terms of going forward, that we've opened the door. There's all sorts of diverse traveller experience. Our ethnicity is not nailed down to one linear, dimensional way of living or being a traveller. So I suppose what I'm saying is, I don't want to be assimilated, and I'm not sure Ireland's understanding of interculturalism is sophisticated enough in terms of really elevating and working in a real way alongside diverse groups, including travellers.
Okay, I think that's a very important point, and indeed, hopefully in the autumn we'll thrash out more issues of identity and ethnicity and look at the complexity of the issues rather than a more black and white version. We have a very long list of questions here and we don't have time to pursue them all. The colonial element features in quite a few of them. There's a response here on the question of religion, noting that a lot of travellers are very religious, as noted by their attendance at the Galway novena here, and indeed also reference to the parish of the travelling people. And I think we're going to have to wrap it up here, but I hope these issues will be pursued further in the autumn. The conference will run from the 16th to the 17th of September, and you can see the various elements here that will be in it: academic, traveller narratives, and inputs from activists. And so, as Eileen Flynn mentioned, there's a need to look forward as well as looking backward. So thank you all very much for coming. I think this was very thought-provoking, and I hope we'll be able to meet in person in the autumn. I'm very grateful again to Ciarán Buckley and John Cunningham in the background, who did enormous work despite the increasingly complex element of protocols and regulations to run a conference nowadays. We look forward also to having Mags Casey on our committee in planning for the autumn. So I would just like to finish off by saying that we are sorry there was a technical hitch for part of Trish Reilly's recording afterwards. So we want to finish off and play you out with that again. And many thanks for coming. Thank you.
Hi, I'd like to thank Patrick Neville for inviting me to this event today. This particular song I'm going to sing is called Broken Lines, and it's about the assimilation of coming from the traveller community into the settled community, and the broken lineage there. And of course, when I was taken into care, I was 8 years of age. That was back in 1981. It was a process that took place as a result of the state's 1963 report, which said they would get rid of the itinerant problem, but they haven't got rid of me. Final solution, 1963, to get rid of a problem of itinerancy. Indigenous people who were born to be free, denied recognition of their ethnicity. Broken homes, broken hearts, broken truths, they make for bad starts. Shattered dreams and broken minds. You can't bridge the distance between those broken lives. Those broken lines, those broken lines. They undersize you, they won't recognize you. They paralyze you, the distance between those broken lines. You lose your direction on a one-way track, but you keep on moving because you can't get back. And it makes no difference, now you can read the signs. When you can't bridge the distance between those broken lines. Temperature changes, you're hot and you're cold. You don't know your value, 'cause you've been bought and sold. As soon as you're in, you're told to go out. And it's those broken lines I'm talking about. Those broken lines, they undersize you, they won't recognize you, they paralyze you, the distance between those broken lines. How you play, if it's on the cards, you're gonna be always a joker, never the queen of hearts, always a loser, and you can never win. And that traveller stamp will always be your sin. they'll undersize you, and they won't recognize you, and they'll paralyze you. The distance between those broken